Good morning, everyone. Being 10:02, I'd like to open the meeting. And I would ask Representative Merchant if he would lead us in the pledge.
Oh, yes.
Thank you. And I just want to remind everyone what our mission is. We are a bipartisan committee that is tasked with investigating and evaluating the state's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The committee will function in a science-based, fact-finding review, specifically acquiring comprehensive, accurate data and all related information pertaining thereto. Areas of particular focus will include the administration of federal guidance, acceptance of federal funds, and implementation of the emergency use authorization vaccination efforts. A report will be issued outlining the committee's findings and the impact on New Hampshire. And this morning, I would truly like to thank Director Buxton, who, after a lot of cancellations, is here. And thank you, Director Buxton, for being here. We are so gracious. I am so grateful that you were able to make our meeting. So the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to meet with you this morning. Going to start with just a couple of things. My name is Rob Buxton. Have the privilege of being the Director of Homeland Security and Emergency Management for the state of New Hampshire. I was appointed and confirmed by the Governor and Council in September of 2022. That date's important for you to recognize as we sit down and have our conversation this morning. Prior to my role as the Director of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, I enjoyed a 30-year career in the New Hampshire Fire Service, with the last 9.5 years serving as the Fire Chief, Emergency Management Director, and Public Health Officer for the town of Hudson, New Hampshire, up until my time that I came to work for the state. So my view today is offering you is more or less as a customer, based on the fact that I was not part of the command staff prior to my arrival, obviously. And I think it's important to recognize that 75% of the agency at HSEM has less than 3 years with the agency. So there has been quite a turnover in that group since we started, okay? And since COVID-19 set in March of 2020. So I think that's important. It's my understanding that we're here to discuss unified command is really the piece that I was asked to talk about today. And that was through the chair and working with the HHS. So I'm really more of a discussion person. So I'm not really here to offer you testimony. I'll start with some definition type stuff, but please, this is your group. I'm here to offer you some input, and I can probably have a unique perspective based on the fact that where I was a customer going through this whole process. So unified command is really the opportunity for the incident commander, the overall authority figure over an incident, to bring together a group of stakeholders to help make decisions. Okay. In this case, through the COVID-19 pandemic, you had a team of folks that were supporting the governor of the state of New Hampshire that was made up of the Department of Health and Human Services, the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, and the National Guard were really the three big legs that came to that stool to support the governor as we made decisions as to how that response was going to move forward. This is a common practice that is utilized across the country on large-scale incidents, and is something that we utilize day in and day out. So from an incident management perspective, it was very key for command and control perspective to utilize that to make sure we were making good decisions and how we were going to deal with really what was ended up being an unprecedented event, not only for New Hampshire but for the country, and move forward from there. So that is the definition. I guess I am more open to asking you what you would like to discuss, or if you have anything specific you would like me to key in on in regards to how that operates or how that how that works and how that affected the overall operation. And I can try to scope that a little bit.
Does anyone have any specific questions? Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for being here to provide this information to us. Just to start out with, could you give us just a sort of 10,000-foot view? Because of course there were so many facets of COVID-19 response from so many different angles. Can you just kind of highlight what parts of that were under the the broad sort of jurisdiction or implementation of Department of Homeland Security?
Under the Department of Homeland Security or underneath the Unified Command?
Let's look, I think, first at Department of Homeland Security.
sure.
Thank you.
So under RSA 21P, the Director of Homeland Security and Emergency Management is charged with the overall planning and implementation of emergency response plans for the state of New Hampshire. And we are charged with making sure that those plans meet not only the needs of the state of New Hampshire, but we're also implementing good best practice from the federal government, from FEMA. So our plan is developed and reviewed every 5 years, and the SCOC pulls together the State Emergency Operations Plan, and that encompasses several different things, everything from energy to sheltering. And we have at our fingertips the ability to bring in state partners, to help support the local communities. In the state of New Hampshire, every disaster starts locally, correct? Right? So if you think about our form of government, that means that we have 234 communities that come directly to HSEM. Okay? There's no in between. There's no county level support. It comes directly to the state. So the SCOC, as we call it, or Emergency Operations Center over on Smoky Bear Boulevard, that's where that takes place. And so all of the requests come in. We actually have a unit that gets stood up, the local liaison line. A local community can go onto WebEOC, which is the program that we utilize, put in a request, and that comes in and it gets filtered into the plan for the next operational period, and that request gets answered. Sometimes they take 5 minutes. Sometimes they may take a couple hours. Sometimes in the COVID-19 world, I'm sure there were some that took over a day. Right? So that's how the process works. It starts locally, the information comes in, and we are support in nature, right? Because every community is really providing those services to the local citizens.
Follow up.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that. I'd like to drill a little deeper into one of the things you mentioned, which is that the New Hampshire Department of Homeland Security seems to fall, as far as their protocols and how they go about things, under the a set of guidelines, best practices, I believe you said, promulgated by FEMA. Can you just give us an idea of whether you might say some, most, or all of the best practices adopted by DHS originate with the federal government?
So FEMA is at the federal level, big picture wise, FEMA rolls up underneath the Department of Homeland Security at the federal level. And they have several different agencies underneath them, one which is FEMA. And we are broken down into 10 regions. And, we're in the New England region, obviously. And our planning process, we receive support from the federal government, right? So for the Stafford Act, which really lays out how we recover, was built on hurricane response, right? So that's the originality of how, recovery process was put in place through the Stafford Act, was how to deal with hurricanes. Over that time, that is certainly expanded as we've seen tornado response, earthquakes, and all those things kick up. But the framework from an incident management standpoint after 9/11 really highlighted the fact that we needed a national framework for how we're going to address incidents. And that is the National Incident Management System. And that breaks down how we look at incident command, unified command, how the branches are set up, so we can address the needs of the public and provide them with the best service, whether it's in the response mode or the recovery mode. We basically take it from the beginning of the incident to the end.
Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Director Buxton, for being here. I'd like to go back up to probably around 30,000 feet. Help me understand, there's the issue of what needs to be done versus how to do it. And I'm trying to drill down into the separation of those two fundamental principles. Is the Department of Homeland Security setting policy, or are you basically implementing the policy that was set?
So can we, just one clarification on my end, when we talk about the Department of Homeland Security, you're talking federally and not the state level?
At the state level. So basically what I'm trying to get to is that there needs to be a decision of what has to be done, which is more the policy side, but there also has to be support to ensure that that decision is
Yeah.
carried out.
Yeah.
So at the state level, is the role of the state Homeland Security and Unified Command to basically execute the orders?
Yeah,
So
so
basically, you're not in a role to make and decide what orders have to be done. It's more to be sure that the order, wherever it came from, is executed.
it's a great question. So the Unified Command Group and bringing those subject matter experts, so whether it's, trying to give you a simple example here, but the subject matter experts are in the room who provide input to the decision maker, meaning the incident commander, who sets policy and then gives it back to the operational group to basically operationalize.
Follow up.
So I want to follow up on the question about the incident command making that decision. Are you making a policy decision or making an operational decision about how to carry out the policy? Can you clarify that for me, please?
We're making an operational decision at the start. Yep.
Representative Evil.
Thank you very much for being here. We've I think we can say we've eagerly awaited having you here to have this conversation. Well, I mean, we're already learning. I mean, I hadn't looked at RSA 21P, so that's good to know that's there and we can look at it. I've just got a few just to learn. So are there a whole set of rules then that are associated with the statute and your implementation powers?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and the answer to that is no.
Oh.
So basically, the reality is we are empowered to implement process and best practice. So we follow under the national framework and NIMS. So that is where that's pulled together, and we pull the planning piece together. But if you were looking to go to the rule set for the state of New Hampshire, and it says incident command means this, and operationally periods are defined as this. Every incident brings its own challenges. So whether it's like the storm that we had at the beginning of April, where we had 182,000 people without power, that is pretty much a very small activation for us because we're bringing in very few stakeholders. When you get to the COVID-19 response, you're really talking about a humongous, unprecedented event that made us look at logistics, how we're going to deliver supplies, how we're going to look at testing, how we're going to look at vaccination efforts, how we're going to look at getting information out to the public health officials and the local emergency management directors so the communities can make decisions at their level in regards to what they were going to do with their practices and how they were going to approach this at the town level, okay, and go from there. So
Can I just ask a couple follow-ups?
Sure.
Okay, I mean, it won't, because we've got to, so on a very like surface level, you said that you folks have an emergency management plan.
Yep.
When was the last time that plan had been updated when COVID hit, number one? And number two, did the plan include pandemic type responses? Because I think what you said is most of what these plans are conceptualized on is a natural act. Then it had to be expanded to like 9/11. But anyway, we're trying, as we get to the preparedness issue.
Yep. So it's a two-part answer.
It was two questions.
Yeah.
though.
So the first part is the last update to the plan was done in 2019. So if you add the 5-year window, we're actually starting right now the review for the state emergency operations plan to update that so it's new and fresh at the end of 24 going into 25. Okay, so that's the first answer. So it had been updated just prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. If you go and you look at 21P, it will talk about the coordinating of efforts with public health. So we partner with public health and DHHS almost on a daily basis. If we have an incident, they're in the EOC very frequently because we're talking about sheltering practices, how to set up regional shelters, how do we get out if we need to get food out, or if a community needs to get water in, how are we managing that, and managing the Red Cross and some of our non-for-profits. So when you look at the second part of the question regarding public health, and it was that plan ready to be nimble enough to bring the response, and that's exactly what it's set up to do. So the National Incident Management System is set up to work with the different stakeholders to adjust its framework to be able to support them. Now, on the public health side and I'm speaking from my public health days here for a second as the public health official in Hudson, we had worked on point of distribution plans and bird flu type stuff prior to this. So there were practices and drills that had been done prior to the COVID-19 response at a smaller scale, right? When you start talking about the COVID-19 response and you start looking at that scale, it was something we hadn't seen. But that doesn't mean the framework wasn't there to be nimble to adjust and bring that forward to be able to support the communities.
Going, and then I'll stop. So, well, because I had heard at some point at the federal level, the pandemic response team had been, basically defunded, and there wasn't a lot of support for the calamity that we were facing at that time. But when you were developing, well, I guess when they were developing the plan, say in 2019, then they would have been looking at best practices for the time.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Lekis?
Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking my question. I just want to follow up on Rep. Marchand's question is what? Bring it closer, yes. Who did make, if you said you made the operational policy, well, who did make the underlying policy which you were then implementing?
Can you clarify exactly what you mean by policy? So if you're talking about executive orders and those types of things?
Well, that would be the governor.
Yeah. So a lot of regarding how policy came out or practices, those came down from recommendations from FEMA to the state level. DHHS would put it through their stakeholder group, bring it back to the command, the unified command to say, hey, we should go this path. And then that was the implementation of that policy was the way that would roll.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Representative Merchant?
And thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again, Director Buxton, for taking the question. One of the things that I think I learned from diving into some of the detail is how well the state of New Hampshire did nationally. And my measurement to say that is based upon the fact of how many people died per 100,000. The only state that did better than we did, according to the data I read, was the state of Hawaii, because they could shut the island down. So in saying that, I would say the state overall did a fairly good job in managing the resources it had to accomplish saving lives. In saying that as well, given the fact that there were things that probably along the way that the unified command or your agency weren't, what worked well and what did we learn from it that we could take going forward with another pandemic? Because I don't think this will be the last one we're going to see.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I couldn't agree with you more that the work that the state of New Hampshire did early into the response and the way they set up the framework and how aggressive they were in regards to putting the unified command into place really paid dividend as we moved into what was started as, my wife's a school teacher, right? So my threshold is, yeah, we're going to be out of school for 2 weeks, and I have 2 kids that are in school, right? So we're going to be out of school for 2 weeks and we're going to go back, everything will be fine, right? And then that obviously blossomed. The state was very aggressive about putting a framework in place to be able to not only support the local communities, but assist them in getting what they needed to make sure that we could get the schools open, to make sure we could provide those resources in an environment that really changed every day, right? It truly changed every single day. You had EOCs that were opening up in local municipalities, and you had folks in roles that they had never truly prepared for. And you had folks working at the state level doing jobs that were, whether it was a call center or whether it was a testing site and supporting a testing site. We really, the way the state approached this and the hands-on approach helped to save and move things forward and be successful. So,
I want to say thank you again.
yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's going to take me a fair bit of research to figure out some of the things that I'm looking for details on. So I'm hoping you can help me narrow this down a little bit, because you've said that generally speaking, the Department of Homeland Security of New Hampshire falls more or less under the direction of the federal Department of Homeland Security. So I'm looking, do you happen to know, or can you get to the committee, what federal and or state statutes authorize the state organization to be under a sort of direct incident or direct command system from the federal agencies?
Yeah, our enabling legislation can be found in 21P.
21P, thank you.
Yep, and it lays out the requirements for planning and response coordination.
Yeah, and if you look under 21P, especially :34, that really talks about Homeland Security and
Yep.
emergency management.
That helps a lot.
Okay, and Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And another question totally unrelated to that one. You mentioned that the DHS is partnering regularly with the Department of Health and Human Services and others. So I'm curious, because as we've heard before, we may not have seen the end of disease. Are there any current plans or activations or anything of that nature underway right now for the current outbreak of avian flu?
It's a great question, and at this point, looking over my memory bank, we don't have an exercise in place right now.
Thank you.
Yep.
Representative Polozov.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here and taking my question. So following up on previous question, for future medical emergencies, what exactly triggers your department involvement? Is it national emergency declaration, or is it some state, local declaration when you get involved?
So you want to know when we activate and when we engage? So I'm going to try to narrow this down because that's a pretty broad question, right? So we talked about every disaster starts locally, right? So and we have different thresholds for how we respond depending on the time of year, right? So if I get up and I have 14,000 people without power in June, our response is not going to be as we're going to be more of a coordinating event instead of having the EOC open based on the fact that it's warm out, right? We want to get power back to folks. It's warm, there's heat, there's ability to have windows open. We really run into a challenge in the middle of the winter when we get and have 14,000 people without power. That's our threshold for opening. And we have a couple different levels at which we open at. So we have what is called enhanced monitoring, where HSEM will actually be in the state EOC monitoring what's happening in the field. That's a big definition there, right? So we come in and we enhancedly monitor what's taking place. If we need to go to a partial activation, that means that we're bringing in more than two stakeholders into the EOC. So that means I'm bringing in, say, I'm going to use the power example again because it's the most common here in New Hampshire. You would bring in the energy sector. We would bring in DHHS, who gives us a hand with sheltering. We would bring in our communications group and 911 group, and we bring in state police because that's how we deal with our communication level. We would also activate our local liaison line, which is going to provide direct access for any community to put a need in and contact us directly. Okay. And then from there, if we need to get more than, a couple ESFs together, then we really look at like, hey, it's time to pivot and go to a full activation. Okay. And that conversation really starts not only with our office, but having further conversation with the governor, like, hey, here's what we're seeing, this is what we're forecasting, and this is how we believe we need to bring this under control, because we don't live in a vacuum, right? We live in a very open communicative response mode, and get that out.
Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Baxton, taking the question. I want to drill back into what Representative Belcher talked about, and that's back to the governance, if you will, of the agency. And I'm not really sure I understand it completely. There is the federal level and there's also the state level. So what role is the federal government doing as far as the governance of your agency versus the state level? Is it really coming more into funding, or do they actually, as someone would say, calling the shots and telling the agency what to do? Or is it really coming back to the state and our own state policymakers in our own state government making those key decisions?
Yep. So to clarify that, so the federal government will give us guidance. We implement the guidance here. We make the decisions here locally. Really, that is a decision that's made here in the state of New Hampshire regarding what we need, what our needs are, what our needs are not, and they help us with from not only from the response side, but from the recovery side. So the recovery side of the house really deals with like, hey, what happens post incident? How do we fix the roads? How do we do things? And what's the recovery money coming back into the state?
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in saying that, akin to it would be not 100% comparable, but something like it. It's kind of like the National Guard, where basically the National Guard is under the state control for the most part, unless it's federalized. But for the most part, so it sounds like the same thing with the state agency. The federal government's there to resource it and provide policies and so forth about how to use the resource, but they're not ultimately, as I said before, telling the agency how to do something.
That would be a reasonable.
Thank you.
Representative Abel.
Thank you. So I don't know if you can speak to this exactly, but that's the way it works, I guess, for Homeland Security. But when you're talking about vaccine approvals and things of that nature, there's not really a role for the state. That sort of directive comes from the federal government.
Yeah, that's a much larger,
Right.
much larger piece, and that would be authorized at the federal level. Yep.
Right. And so then it would just be up to the state to how to implement, how to use those
How to-
vaccines as part of its response plan, or
How to implement and how to distribute.
implementation and so not assessment of their validity, but implementation and distribution. Okay, then I have just another question. So, part of our job here is to assess the efficacy of the New Hampshire response. And we had been told that actually your department was doing exactly the same thing. So is that part of your development of a new emergency management plan, or are you doing a separate kind of report assessing the COVID response?
Yep. The state of New Hampshire is under contract with a company called Tidal Basin. And for the last 12 months, they have been working through the after action review process for COVID-19. And not only looking at not only looking at the response, but basically saying, hey, here were the shortcomings, or here are the improvement areas to help us grow, right? That report is actually due out the end of this month. So that is not available yet.
When that is available, do you think you could send a copy to our committee?
Once it's accepted and made public, yeah, that'd probably be available.
When do you think that might be?
It's coming in the end of June. We'll go through a review process, get it to the governor's office, and that's really their report, and I don't really have a timeline on that yet. Sorry.
I know you don't have a timeline, but your review process, what are you thinking it's going to take? A month, 2 months?
Yeah, I would assume that our SEOP update will not wait, but we'll get started, and then we'll review that after action review and see what pieces we need to put into place into the updated plan. So we'll wait before we finish our work on updating the emergency operations plan.
So I guess my more specific question was regarding the report itself. It's due about the end of June, and it has to go through a review process. Obviously, your department's going to have a piece in that reviewing it. What is your department's timeline? Do you have a deadline of when you're going to have that review completed?
So once I have the report in hand, it'll become a top priority to read and get our folks engaged on what that looks like and get stakeholders at the table that need to review that report.
Thank you, Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think now that we have a little bit of a better concept of the command structure and how that portion went, I'd like to get a little bit into sort of enforcement mechanisms and what sort of enforcement actions fall under the Department of Homeland Security regarding anything to do with COVID response.
So you're really talking about what enforcement capabilities come underneath the governor's office through the state of emergency. And that is really where that is driven from. And that is underneath the governor's powers, underneath the state of emergency powers, that he has the ability to enforce certain things and enforce law. And that obviously is enabling legislation for him to empower those things.
Yeah, so there is a section called Governor Duty, and it's 21P:43-A, just for reference. Representative Belcher, you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for helping to clarify the source of the authority. I'd like to go a little bit deeper, if you're prepared to have any information on what sort of specific enforcement actions may have fallen under the Department of Homeland Security that may have been taken as a part of any of the orders or anything else that was occurring under COVID response.
Yeah, so what I can tell you is under Chapter 4 of the powers of the governor, 4:45, it outlines the state of emergency practices and what the governor is able to empower and go from there. Regarding what HSEM directly during the COVID response was responsible from an enforcement standpoint, I can't answer that question as I sit here today without going back and reviewing. So I apologize.
Follow-up?
Yes, and just if at any point you were any of your people could get some information to this committee on specific actions that were taken by DHS, that would be very helpful to us. Thank you.
Representative Merchant?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking the question. Given that there's a contract with Tidal Basin, I'm assuming, having worked on some of these contracts myself, there's going to be a statement of works, something in which the contractor is supposed to be assessing and what their obligations are under the contract. Is that statement of work somewhere publicly, because it must have gone through the governor and council in order for that contract to be reviewed, and where will we find it?
Yeah, I don't have the contract with me, but I believe that would be something that you could get from Administrative Services. That's a contract that was signed by the agency and available publicly.
And that would go through the Department of Administrative Services with Commissioner Arlinghouse?
Yep.
Okay, and then follow up, if I may. what I'm trying to get to is trying to understand under that report when it comes out, again, back to the fundamental question I asked before, are they trying to assess the operational response or trying to assess the policy that were put into place that were operationalized on both of them? That's what I'm trying to get to. Do you know at this point in time what the intent of the report was? It was looking strictly at how we responded and used the resources, or basically at that point in time, how we set some policies?
Yeah, I think it looked at how we responded. It did not look at individual policy, I don't believe. But I don't have the scope in front of me to 100% answer that.
Representative Ebel?
I think getting that contract with the scope of services and everything would be really, really helpful. I think it's fair to say that as a committee, it's really difficult for us without staff to assess the response. So I'm curious, just generally, do you know what the cost of the contract was? And obviously you folks didn't have and it's also good to have an objective observer, I know, but I'm sure you folks didn't have the staff to do it. It sounds like a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it is a huge undertaking. I used to know that number, but I apologize that is.
Do you have a ballpark?
Yeah, I don't.
Okay.
I would. It was over $100,000 for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a year's worth of
It's a year's worth of work. And so we had gotten this from Tricia Tilley when she described what you were covering. And what she said was preparedness, command, communication, decision-making, financial management, health and medical, logistics, public-private partnerships, and public information. Does that sound?
That's what you expected me to speak to this morning?
No,
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's an incredibly comprehensive report. And,
Yeah, it
and
is.
I think based on our mission, we're just, it's a narrower analysis.
Yeah.
But I think from our perspective, whatever that report reveals will be hugely, helpful. And I think part of the chair's questioning was because we basically are looking at a early November timeframe if we were going to make any recommendations. So
yeah.
we're hoping that we get something really good and useful before we are supposed to take some action.
Okay.
Thanks.
I did take a note regarding the scope of the process, so hopefully to help you with that.
Representative Merchant?
Thank you. In regards to this kind of analysis being done at the state level with the tidal basin contractor, can you comment about, is this something unique to New Hampshire or other states doing the same kind of journey? What I'm trying to get to, if there are other states doing it, it'd be interesting to see how our evaluation done through tidal basement may compare to some of the other states, at least some of the key indicators within those reports.
Yeah, I think that the after action review process in the emergency management field is something that we seek out a lot, right? So yes, other states are doing reviews. Other states have completed their reviews already. And this is the process. This is one of the services that Tidal Basin provides, and they've done other states on top of that.
Follow up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in saying that, I mean, I would find it very interesting to look at how Tidal Basin looks at and analyzing our response, but more importantly, how that is compared to some of the other states that they have possibly done, and what were the strengths that we had, what were the weaknesses we had, and try to understand from that point of view, this is what we did. How does it stand up against what other states have done? Because I think at the end of the day is we're trying to measure our response, but not do it in a vacuum, but trying to do it in a more comprehensive analysis, not just internally, but also externally across the country.
Yes, I agree with that.
Representative Polozov?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is about implementation. I understand that on federal level, to implement the decisions, they were managing different there are always some fractions who are fighting against it. So they were managing how information is being spread and identifying some misinformation. And on the federal level, they have CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the Federal Department of Homeland Security, who is helping with that. So I wonder how it's happening on state level under your department. Do you have any involvement when you implement certain decision? Do you identify some information and some how to fight misinformation, how it's happening here?
Yeah, so we work very closely with CISA today in regards to how to make sure that we're getting out the right pieces of information. You know, the federal government has provided a lot of resources to us to make sure that we are, our cybersecurity pieces are secure, make sure that we have guidance to help communities develop. If you think about where we were, March of 2020, regarding technology and where we are today, the utilization of technology has just blossomed over time. You know, I can tell you that I have 2 kids at home that are they would tell you, what did COVID-19 do for them? They got cell phones because they needed to be able to talk with their friends, right? That was very important to us. But that utilization of technology doesn't come without its own risks, right? You know, and how information is pushed out, and how we're verifying information, and we really try to drill down and make sure that we're pushing out appropriate information that can be validated, and go from there. So everything that comes in has a source, and make sure that we're making a decision on quality pieces of information.
Representative Blekis.
So who made the decisions as to what information was being put out? Was that you, or was that coming from elsewhere and then you were just making sure that it was going out, or how did that work?
So there was a Joint Information Center, or the JIC as it's called, is attached to the Unified Command, and their job is to deal with the messaging piece. And I think if you recall, and I'm just from a 30,000 foot level because I wasn't involved in the day-to-day conversations, but if you look at it, one of the successes that I see as far as a local official at the time, but as a taxpayer here in the state, was the amount of press conferences that were held to push information out. Really was an idea or a theory to get quality information out as fast as we could. And that was pushed together, and how they reviewed that internally was basically pushed through that Joint Information Center and then verified by the subject matter experts that were advising the governor. You know, whether it was the Health and Human Services recommendation that came in, or whether it was an emergency management recommendation that came in, all of those things come in, and a decision is made, because at some point there needs to be deconfliction done to make sure we stay in line with where we want to be as a state. And then from there, we push information out. And I'm not telling you folks anything you don't know. We're a very locally controlled state, right? So we want to get information down so the local government leaders can make the best decision for their communities. So it's a trickle-down process.
Follow up.
Thank you. I just want to drill down into that some, because as we've had various speakers in, there was information that was available that was not being put out that could have been very useful. And so the question is, who was kind of the gatekeeper on that? Who decided whether the information was good information or bad information? Who decided which information to push and which to kind of silence?
Yeah. So from a day-to-day operational piece through the COVID-19 response, I really can't comment on that because I was not in this role at that time. I was not engaged in that conversation.
Would that be something you could find out and send to us?
I can ask the question.
Thank you.
I would assume that from a communications standpoint, that will be something that is reviewed in the after action review.
Thank you.
Representative Polizov.
So, on our during our previous committee meetings, we heard that under governor in New Hampshire, there is a tendency to stick with decisions that were initially made. So I wonder if you would agree with this. And my concern is, for example, with COVID response, science was changing very rapidly. Initially, we were hoping that vaccines will stop transmission. Then at some point, science discovered that they do not stop transmission, but because there was tendency on federal level, on local level, to stick with decisions that were made, like there was like, it was a long process. And backing up to my previous question, like if something was identified as misinformation, but the science already changed, and maybe it's actually not misinformation, but we are still sticking to the old decision, I see a problem in it. So what your thought on it, and would you agree that New Hampshire tends to stick with old decisions?
So I don't know that that's a question that I can give you a quality answer on. But I would share that if you look at what was taking place during the COVID-19 response, I think you probably heard this a couple of different times, but it was literally, you know, like flying a plane and building it at the same time. If you look at the way you did things in your home at the beginning of COVID-19 and the way you approached them at the end were far different, you know. If you look at the way things were done at local municipalities at the beginning of COVID-19 versus the end of COVID-19, what were the communities that pivoted to take new information into consideration and do things like opening town halls back up and how they were processing information, that I think you would see across the state was at different levels, you know, and that is where that local control really drives that bus, and that is a decision that is made locally.
Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to follow up a little bit on sort of that same line of inquiry, because part of the charge of this group is going to be to try to see if there might be any recommendations to be made for future events that could occur. So without necessarily looking specifically to what happened in COVID, but more just asking your overall impression, do you feel like the current organizational structure is such that it's sufficiently nimble to be able to adapt to changing circumstances that occur in an emergency type, such as a pandemic? And and the second part of that is, do you believe that, or do you see any way that there might be recommendations made to make alterations that would allow for new science and new information to be adopted in a rather rapid manner? Because as I think we all know, there can sometimes be a tendency within bureaucracy to have a difficult time adapting. So do you have any recommendations, or do you see any ways to maybe make things better?
Yeah, so I think you're talking about communication, right? And how we, you know, it comes down to how do we communicate, right? I would share with you that one of the most enjoyable parts to my job is the fact that I have direct access into the governor's office and with every commissioner across the state of New Hampshire. So if I need to have communication, or I need to get a piece of information out or verify a piece of information, it is literally one call away. When you're under a response model where you're in a unified command, that is something that helps you because the network is already created before the incident really takes place. If you look at the state of New Hampshire, that is not just something that happened after the pandemic. Homeland Security and emergency management in the state is a very active part of what happens. We really coordinate a lot of things, whether it's talking about the NASCAR race that'll be 2 weeks from now, or a snowstorm or a flooding event. Like, we have direct access to everybody to be able to have that conversation. So I do believe that we have the ability to be nimble. The question regarding, like, hey, how do we move this forward? I think one of the things that I come into this chair still fairly fresh is like, hey, we recognize that there has been turnover across the state. That means that we need to put training and exercise and development work together to make sure that we're pulling that together. And what does that look like? And how do we work with those partners like public health? Because you have the regional public health network that is out in the field day in and day out partnering. And our goal is to bring the local communities together. So you have public health, the municipalities, and the schools, and try to get them under one tent and be able to, hey, how are we gonna address this issue? What does that look like? From a workshop to a tabletop where we're in a room to a full-scale exercise really is the goal moving forward. We house a training, exercise, and development group within our agency, and they're tasked with everything from a hazmat incident all the way through an active assailant drill. So those touch points are taking place, and we partner with Commissioner Weaver and her staff and Steph Locke and that group to really bring that together, because we're not going to stand by ourselves. We can't work in a vacuum, right? So we're very, very open in communicating, pushing the requests across, and supporting, because as I go back to where I was, I don't know how long, almost an hour ago now, we're supportive in nature to help the communities move the initiatives forward.
Representative Ebel.
So this is a really broad question. When you initially spoke, you said that you were not in the role during the pandemic that you are in now, and you could speak to it more as a customer rather than a.
Yeah, sure.
And I would say if there's a weakness in the folks that we haven't had come and testify to us, we haven't really heard from municipalities so much. So is there something you would like to share, what you thought was done well, what you didn't? I'll just throw that open.
Yeah, no, I think I appreciate that question, because it is a challenge, right, to hear from 234 different communities in regards to what that looks like. I would share that I thought the state did a tremendous job in pushing information out so we could make decisions at the local level. And how do you pivot to be able to provide services to the constituents and make it successful and make it safe? So I think communication wise and logistically, we did a very good job. I could literally go in, put an order in, very short order after March. If we were running short on a piece of equipment, I could put in, hey, what's the status on masks? Like, and the next day be like, hey, meet the National Guard's person over at the Exit 6 DMV facility, and they're going to be there doing your distribution. Your order will be there. Or if you need something earlier, drive up to the warehouse and we'll get it. And they had put processes in place. And if you think about that, those are all things that show how nimble we can be as a state, because those processes, and taking a National Guards person and basically saying, hey, can you stand this process up? I'm sure there were some that were like, they didn't review this in training, right? Like and this is in my real world job, I'm a project manager. So I use those skills to help make us successful. And that's really the key to the success in this state. And to have that hands-on approach from the governor's office on down, to be engaged in what was happening, and have him talking with the fire chiefs, with the emergency management directors, with law enforcement and the public health officers, that was important. So I think we did a pretty good job from that. And it was such a large response that, we were all kind of growing at the same time. So.
Follow up.
So I didn't hear anything negative there. Was there anything you wish we'd done better?
What
recognizing your current position.
Yeah, no, I get that.
fine.
Yeah, no, I get that. What could be, I think that obviously the challenges regarding executive order and policy and those types of things certainly come an implementation piece that's debated. So it's debated here and then it's debated locally. And the communication was very good, getting information down. But what was the breakdown below? So it was more below, I would say. But then once we got over that, it was good. So I don't really have anything.
Okay.
Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and also Director Buxton. I want to follow up on that question or the response to the question about the local control and communication. In your opinion, was the fundamental issue about how things were being handled from an operational point of view of getting resources to the communities, or more about the policy that was being communicated down to local municipalities? Because there's a difference between agreeing with the resources we need in order to get the vaccine, whatever else we need, versus the policy behind that. Because if the policy was really what was being debated at the local level and throughout the state, that's a different issue than how we respond to it.
Yeah.
And I want to be clear, we're talking about how we respond to it, not debating the policy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it was the response. It was the operational piece. It was the implementation. It wasn't like we weren't opening up new debate on policy that had been developed at the state level.
Representative Polozov.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Director Buxton. Different question. In the beginning of your testimony, you mentioned that 75% of people in your department are new people, and they joined in less than 3 years. And I wonder how it's compared to other department, and was it always like this? Is it something new? Do you know reasons? Does it have anything to do with, like, I don't know, COVID response burned out or something?
No, it's a great question. I would say that it's probably multifaceted, right? You had folks that at the end of the COVID-19 response were ready to go home. They were ready to be home for a while, right? And you saw some retirements and folks that were in key positions within the state that have moved on. And that is just comes from the work. The human body can only work at a rate for so long before it needs to take a break, right? We also have had a host of staff internally to HSEM because of the COVID-19 response that has actually moved on to go to work for the federal government. They're actually working for FEMA now because you're talking about a branch of FEMA from a public assistance standpoint that was non-existent prior to COVID-19. And those opportunities have provided career growth for folks that really got into this business to see their careers grow. And some of that was a natural path. And then you probably had some folks who were like, yeah, I don't want to do that anymore and just found a different path and moved on. So, but overall, I would say the changeover in the staff has been something of a natural progression, and folks take different opportunities, want to do a different style of work because crisis management is long. It's hard.
Representative Lekis.
I still want to go down that policy path, if you don't mind. And so your department, your job really is implementation of the policy, and you didn't open up anything to question that policy. You went with whatever. So I want to, just so we know that in the future of this committee, that we're talking to the right people as far as policy. So the governor, obviously, DHHS, who else would have been? I mean, policy came from federal, right? But then as far as for our state, in deciding whether to follow the federal policy, not, what parts we were going to, who was developing it that you then had to implement, I guess, so that we can make sure we talk to those people?
Yeah, so I would go right back to where we started when we identified the Unified Command folks, right? So you had the Department of Health and Human Services, you had HSCM, and you had the National Guard, in the Unified Command role, providing support to the governor. I can't answer on a day-to-day basis who else they sought subject matter expertise from, but I can tell you from a foundational level, those were the three key agencies that helped develop things to move forward.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Representative Ebel?
Thank you so much for all these questions. A lot of times we're just sitting here listening, but
Yeah.
not today. So I don't know a lot about Homeland Security, when it was actually created in the state of New Hampshire, and 2000 when? I think 2002. 2002. It obviously must have evolved. I wondered who the Homeland Security head was during the time of the pandemic. And I wondered if you could just speak generally about the history and maybe how it's evolved since COVID, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I'll take you back a little further than that even.
Good.
So pre 9/11, Homeland Security did not exist in the federal government, right? 9/11 really catapulted the opportunity to create the Division of Homeland Security at the federal level. But the state of New Hampshire had a dual-headed agency, and it actually started out as a civil defense back, the old days, right? It started as civil defense, and then for those that have been in their chairs for a while, a gentleman by the name of Don Bliss, who was a state fire marshal, actually was the fire marshal and the emergency management director for the state. After 9/11 happened, Chris Pope, who was the EMD for the city of Concord, actually came in and was part of the formalization of the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Group. Okay. What's changed since then? I would tell you the landscape of Homeland Security and emergency management in the country is a landscape that is evolving today. If you look at the number of storms that we're having, you look at the number of other security functions that we're dealing with, surrounding and supporting multiple different venues in regards to how we deal with cybersecurity now. That is an annex that is coming into as part of the state emergency operations plan. 20 years ago, that would have never been a piece of that, right? We didn't even understand what the impacts of that were. So we are an agency that really puts a lot of people in the room to put plans together for bad days. And that's really the goal, to make sure we are on that cutting edge, to make sure we're bringing those folks together. And we're the coordinating arm.
Follow up.
So in developing the next emergency management plan for the state of New Hampshire, it sounds like that's going to look quite a bit different and be far broader, because because climate change, there's huge storm response issues, which isn't our purview, thank the Lord. But then you're going to have an aspect of that will be pandemic or health crisis.
Yeah.
A broader one, presumably, than what you have.
And we'll work that with
now.
our stakeholder groups, right? So Department of Health and Human Services will be key stakeholders in bringing that together and helping us develop that. That none of this gets done in a vacuum. You really make sure that you're getting the right people in the room to help develop because they have to take ownership of those things. We can only be the subject matter expert of so many points. They need to take ownership of those responses and help develop those plans.
And I assume there might be legislative recommendations perhaps as part of that, or
I would assume over time you'll see some of that.
okay, thanks.
Representative Chrétien.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my question. I'm still trying to formulate it, so forgive me. Just going back to the sort of personnel turnover piece that we were talking about earlier. Do you feel, are there takeaways from COVID in terms of where we need to be with staffing, or things that we should sort of activate with, maybe emergency hiring, things like that, in the event of sort of a long emergency? Like
Yeah, no, I
epidemic?
appreciate that question. I tell stakeholder groups this a lot. Emergency management is the best team sport in existence. And it is truly a team sport, right? Our job at Homeland Security and Emergency Management is to provide the framework to bring the subject matter experts in and coordinating their messaging and making sure we're getting information out. Certainly, currently today, we have 15 open federal disasters. So on the recovery side of the house, you look at what does that mean? And COVID-19 is one of those disasters. Okay. So what does that mean? That means that we're working with FEMA. Last month, I believe they pushed out almost $8 million in disaster relief from the federal government here locally. So those are the areas. It's really the long-term recovery piece that becomes a mechanism of challenge. The good news is that we also receive management costs from the federal government to manage those things here locally. So we have that nimbleness to help bolster that when we need to. We run a pretty lean agency, and that's helps us to provide a more customer service that is very, it's not uncommon for somebody to pick up and call me. I'm not insulated from that, nor do I want to be insulated from that. I want to be available and making sure that they're getting what they need, and that's an important part of the job in my view. So
I think for purposes of our discussion, I think that I'm going to read 21P:34, what the purpose of Homeland Security and Emergency Management is. And maybe if the definition may need to be changed or tweaked in the future, but I think it would really help us understand. And what it says is, because of the possibility of the occurrence of natural and human-caused disasters resulting from fire, flood, hurricane, earthquake, prolonged power outages, disruption or contamination of the food or water supply, degradation of critical facilities and vital systems, disruption of communication systems, or other natural, technological, or human causes, including acts of terrorism, and in order that the state of New Hampshire will be adequately prepared to cope with such disasters, and generally in order to preserve the lives and the property of the people of the state, a state division of emergency services, communications, and management is hereby created under the direction of the Director of the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. The emergency management powers provided in this subdivision are conferred upon the governor and upon other executive heads of governing bodies of the state, the creation of local organizations for emergency management, and in political subdivisions of the state is authorized, and provision is made for the rendering of mutual aid among this subdivision in the policy of the state, that all emergency management functions of the state be coordinated to the maximum extent with the comparable functions of the federal government, including its various departments and agencies of other states and localities, and of private agencies of every type, to the end that the most effective preparation and use may be made of the nation's manpower, resources, and facilities for dealing with any disaster or incident of terrorism that may occur. It's pretty broad, and it encompasses a lot. But I think it's really important to understand what the purpose of the department is. And also stated at the beginning of this was that every community, I believe, in New Hampshire, and please correct me if I misspeak, has an emergency management unit in place. I know in my town of Barnstead, we do have people that head that up, and I think in other towns there are point people in place.
It is a requirement for every community to have an emergency management director. If the governing agency, Board of Selectmen, Town Council fail to appoint somebody, they take on that responsibility until such time that they appoint somebody.
Representative Ebel.
Just getting back again to the feeling of the localities, to how it all rolled out. I mean, you've shared your views. Do you think there's response groups in the towns? I mean, if not, that's fine, but I was just curious.
Yeah, I think my recommendation would be that I believe that was part of the scope of the
So
for the
we'll
after
see.
action.
Yeah.
So I think that there's probably some, let's see what comes out of the report mechanism, and then go from there.
Just as a follow-up.
Sure.
Is there an org chart for Homeland Security, just so we could sort of see, is it closely held, or is it something we could see?
Oh, we certainly can provide that to you. That's
Yeah,
not a big deal.
I just
There's
think
no
it would be
secrets there.
interesting for us to kind of understand the setup.
It can give you a broad level overview. That's not too heavy of a lift.
Okay.
Representative Lekus.
You said $8 million had come as still part of the cleanup. Can you explain what type of things that is
Yeah,
will be spent for?
that was in 1 month. That was in 1 month
oh,
for
wow.
15 disasters, right? So probably for this committee's view, the question, if I was sitting on your side of the table, would be, do you have an estimate as to what the COVID-19 response public assistance was for the state of New Hampshire? And that number is over $300 million.
And I guess partly I was wondering if that's continuing to come in, because you said we're still cleaning that up. What type of things is that being used for?
So those are the money that is coming in is now supporting projects that have been completed, right? So you had projects that were done during the COVID response that are being scoped, continue to be scoped and put in and now funded on the backside. Whether a hospital needed to pivot and make an adjustment because of COVID-19 to a filtration system, or they needed to bring in staffing from another area, the federal government is providing assistance to basically keep the hospitals from going bankrupt from supporting the COVID-19 response.
Okay, thank you.
And the local communities, right? So whether it's an EMS agency or a fire department or community, there may have been things that they did that were eligible to receive compensation back because they were tied directly to the COVID-19 response.
Okay, thank you. So it's kind of retrospective money at this point.
It is a 100% reimbursement-based process.
Okay, thank you.
So speaking on the dollars and the reimbursement, now we heard from Commissioner Caswell that they handled a lot of the funds of dispersing monies. But when we're talking about hospitals, is the money coming in from the state and then being dispersed to the hospitals, or is it being dispersed directly to them, I guess is my question.
So you're talking about two separate buckets of money. Commissioner Caswell deals with the ARPA funds, as they may be called, and we're dealing with the Disaster or Public Assistance Program. The Public Assistance Program flows directly from the federal government to the state of New Hampshire, and then we distribute it out. And that is all done through payments as projects are awarded. And then we help support the local communities to make sure that they're getting their projects and paperwork and receipts and all those things that are needed to get their money back from the federal government. We support that, and that's paid for through that management cost that we talked about.
Okay, so it's that is another aspect of what your department handles. Do any of these contracts and these monies have to be approved by the Executive Council?
Yes.
Thank you. Representative Ebel.
So what's going on at the federal level now, as far as, I mean, are they doing sort of an after-action report on the pandemic response? And is that an ongoing process? Have you guys been sent information, more information on best practices, or what, I guess we're certainly not looking at the federal government's preparedness for the next pandemic. But what I was wondering is how much is getting pushed down to the states, or do you anticipate more will be?
So I anticipate that as the federal government continues to look at the response through what we'll call the next chapter is going to be the closeout process to COVID-19. And they start looking at like, hey, what worked, what didn't work. That will in turn drive change to programs like public assistance. Why did it take 24 months to get a payment back to a local community that had to expend local dollars because they had an outbreak at the local fire department and their EMS agency would have not have been able to respond because all of their workers were contaminated, right? So those types of changes are the big picture stuff that they're looking at. We participate in giving them feedback in regards to like, hey, we really need this to change to be more nimble. Our goal is to like cut down on the number of steps and make sure that we're getting money into the right hands as quickly as possible.
Representative Blackus.
So besides communities, does that include schools, or does that money also come through your organization?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Schools and nonprofits.
Representative Ebel.
So I guess my question was maybe, I was wondering from a health standpoint, if they must be looking at, I just don't know, like all the different aspects of how a country responds to a pandemic, not just how the funding is pushed
Right.
out, but, anyway, it's
I'm-
multifaceted.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that question, but I appreciate it. Yeah.
So you mentioned before that guidance would come down from FEMA. And I understand that you weren't in this role
Yep.
during COVID, so bear with me. And that, do we just, you kind of said we would then choose what to roll out. So we had emergency guidelines. Who discerns if they're the right thing for our state? Not only the right thing for our state, but is the information we're getting accurate? So I guess how do we discern the difference?
Yeah. I'll try. So as information comes down, that would come in and the stakeholder groups, including heavily relied on DHHS. And, we got to know a couple of names very well that we saw each night talking about the science piece, right? And I'm sure that they were providing input as to what was going to work in New Hampshire. But I was not in the room at that time, so.
And you mentioned that you were in incident management and public health. Which role were you in during the COVID response?
I was the emergency management director for the town of Hudson through the COVID response.
Okay. And in that role, you mentioned that there was a lot of positives, that there was a lot of communication with the state, and that we were able to react pretty quickly to the needs of the municipalities, which I think is fantastic. But when you got guidance from the state, do you have to implement the guidance that is given, or can you discern it, take time to look at it and see if it's what's best for your community?
It would depend on how it was written. If it was an executive order that was coming down regarding something in the Food Network, we would have to implement that. There was executive orders that came down, and that's the way things worked. And that was okay because it provided support when a community needed to implement something. And then there were other areas where we probably debated at length.
So just want to clarify just for myself. So if something came down, an executive order came down, anyone in the emergency management position in a town, that was it. I mean, the executive order was the executive order, and that was basically what needed to be followed.
Yep.
If it was guidance, and that's where the discernment could come in.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Representative Lucas.
Just to use Hudson as an example, since you were there, and that's my town. I'm thinking about the things that affected people in the town more directly, like who made the decisions? Was that part of your job when it came to, for instance, during election time? The election time changed a lot how we ran them than how we'd always done elections before. So where did was that you and the moderator?
Correct. We
Okay.
provided support to the moderator by state statute. The moderator is in charge of the election process. So figuring out how to run an election in town meeting, because we're a Senate Bill 2 community in Hudson
Right,
at that
right.
time, how to run town meeting and get that done was done in coordination with the moderator and supportive in nature to him.
So you would have given advice, but he would have made the final decisions as how to do it. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Representative Ebel.
Yep. And who was the Homeland Security Director at the time of the pandemic?
The pandemic would have been Jennifer Harper.
Okay. And then how many employees do you have now? I'm just curious.
So I would tell you fully filled, which we are not. We should be about 85. And we're probably running about 17 vacancies today.
And is that quite a few more than what were in place during the pandemic, or is it about the
That's
same?
pretty consistent.
It's about the same.
Yeah, pretty consistent. If there's any area that has grown, it has been the recovery branch, and that is because of the number of disasters that they're handling at this point. We specifically have a team that manages just the COVID-19 projects because they're very specific.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions for the director? Oh, Representative Lucas.
It's kind of a statewide and potentially a nationwide issue that all the departments, everybody's seeing is vacancies, right? And I'm wondering if you had specific ideas as to what is keeping you or from filling those vacancies. What are the issues that you're running up against? Because that's a general thing we need to address.
Yeah, I think some of that is availability of labor. If you look at public safety in general, whether it's emergency management, fire, police, EMS, and you look at the number of applicants available. When I took my first entrance exam a couple days ago, there was 900 of us for 3 jobs in the city of Nashua at that point that took the exam. You have departments in the state on the fire side of the house that have rolling application periods right now, and they're not receiving any applications. And that's just from the avenue of like who's available and what's a requirement. And some of that comes from the vacancy rate comes from the COVID-19 burnout per se. My daughter is gainfully employed as a nurse today. And she went to school through COVID, but if you look at the vacancy rate in the hospitals, it's all related. And we have a group actively working internally on how to do recruitment and retention better, to make sure we're going out, and we've bolstered our intern program to make sure we're bringing in college students to provide opportunities for them to come in and learn about emergency management. Plymouth State, UNH, Riviera College out of Nashua, three big homeland security and emergency management programs are run through there. So we try to partner with them as best we can. So
Follow up.
Is there something we can do as a state that would, that you think would help with that?
not as I'm here today.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Beeble.
So, just again, thinking about the pandemic response, is there somebody on the Homeland Security staff that takes care of, that's sort of an interface person from a health standpoint, or is that pretty much DHHS that you bring in as a stakeholder?
Stakeholders from DHHS.
Okay, thanks.
Director Buxton, I'd like to thank you for being here on a Friday. And it's been a pleasure. And I can really appreciate you being here.
I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate the conversation, and I've got a couple of notes, but we'll give you as much support as we can.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend. I think there's a couple of people that have some things that on the committee. I know Representative Belcher and Representative Merchant have some paperwork that they would like to pass around and introduce.
Thank you.
Seeing it's 11:30, I've been asked for a quick break. So why don't we come back at 11:35 and continue on? Yeah, perfect. Okay, got another minute, but everyone's here, so, all right, Representative Merchant, you sent out some information that you'd like entered into the record?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I basically came across a report that was recently published dealing with this relatively comprehensive review, looking at masks and face coverings and so forth being helpful, if you will, in reducing the transmission of respiratory infections, including COVID. And I just want to be sure that it's in a record that we did look at this, at least I did. I'm sharing with the community so you folks can as well. Is that when you look at masks and mask mandates and so forth, there's been some concern about the effectiveness of those devices as well as the mandates themselves. So I just want to enter into the record that a comprehensive review, it's a 65-page report, I handed to the chair. I thought I'd save the printer, so not to give everyone, if you will, a copy of the full report. I do have a copy for everyone, which is the first couple of pages, which is a summary of the report.
Thank you, Representative Merchant, and if you could just, if you have a chance to email the comprehensive report to the committee, that would be wonderful, and that way we can make sure that it gets uploaded when all the other documents get uploaded into the website, so that we have that there. Thank you. Do you want to any further discussion on this, or are you all set, or?
No, just to know if the committee wanted to speak to this or at all, or wanted some time to digest it and come back whenever we come back and talk about the merits of the report and how it fits into what we are trying to accomplish here with our committee.
Absolutely. Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I've just barely started to review this a little bit, but I want to see if my understanding is the same as other people's understanding on this, which is this is a retrospective meta-analysis of various studies looking at masking and its effect on the transmission of respiratory viruses, both in the clinical and separately in the non-clinical public settings. And if I may summarize, what I'm finding is that according to this study, and I haven't had a chance to dive deep into it, but the summary suggests that the findings are that non-surgical, fairly high level N95 and higher masks that are done through proper fit testing do have the capacity to reduce transmission, but it does not have those findings for surgical or cloth or other masks that were generally available to the public during the pandemic. Is that correct?
I think it's a fair statement. I would say that what they're referring to is when you use an appropriate mask and you use it appropriately, it does reduce the transmission. So that's really the crux of the report, and I want to be clear about that. We're not talking about a cloth covering. We're talking about an N95.
Thank you, and Representative Cratian.
Thanks. This is actually the one that I had sent out as well. There should be an email with a nice, actually, Twitter thread from the first author that kind of like walks through the findings if anyone's interested in that or would find that maybe easier. One thing that I did want to highlight from this, I think they do a really good job of walking through some of the challenges in doing real world tests of masking, particularly a lot of the studies that they looked at, difficult to I guess look at the outcomes because they're looking at, adherence rates of, 40%, things like that. So it is really hard to tell how effective even those like cloth masks are. They did do a fairly, they did mention one study that was like a community study that was done in Bangladesh that they highlight as having had better methodology, I think, than some of the other studies that were out there, and showed that even with like an uptake rate of 45% or something like that in the community related to 10% in the non-intervention group. They did see significant reductions in transmission, reductions in deaths, and symptomatic illness during COVID. So, sorry, even partial uptake of some of the available masks did have an effect, they said, although obviously N95s are better. Hopefully, I'm
And also,
articulating that well.
if I can follow up on the comment, if you look at one of the key factors they talked about in here was that it does provide a social cultural symbol to remind people of the importance of what's going on. So even though per se it may not be 100% effective in transmission of the disease or the respiratory infection, it does provide a reminder to people about the seriousness of what we're talking about. So from a social point of view and a cultural point of view, there is merit to that in of it by itself.
Thank you for that. I think that for me, I'm going to have to take some time to really look at this and review it. So it's a lot of information to go over. So maybe when we come back in September, we can have this as a topic of discussion. Representative Ebel.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Representative Merchant and Creation for bringing this forth. I mean, I think we've had a lot of testimony from folks who questioned some of the standard operating procedure during the pandemic, the vaccine policies or the vaccination policies, the masking policies. I don't think we've had much testimony that we've taken that has sort of supported how the government did roll out its programs. So this is one bit of evidence that I think is really helpful for us to consider. And I do very much look forward to this after action report that they're preparing now. I think from a science-based standpoint, it'll be really helpful.
Absolutely. Representative Belcher, did you have something you want to introduce? Oh, you have a letter that, sorry.
I spaced out on that one for a second. Thank you. So as we had previously discussed, we had considered the idea of sending out a committee request for information, documents and whatnot, based on some of the testimony we received, so we could have a more complete picture and take more things into consideration within our record. So I've drafted up a something to consider sending off to the federal government, particularly the departments of Federal Food and Drug Administration, as well as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, simply asking questions of them and requesting some information regarding such things as their vSafe data and the like. So everyone should have a copy of that.
Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for bringing this letter to us, Representative Belcher. I have a fundamental question, is how this letter ties back into the charge that was provided to us in the RSA, because I look at the charge, and I'll read it to the committee collectively. The bipartisan committee is tasked with investigating and evaluating the state's response to COVID. I don't know how this is going to help us with the evaluation of the state's response. I think this gets into maybe the validity of the resources the state used to respond to it, but I don't know how it actually supports our underlying mission here, which is to respond to the state and how the state responded to it, versus dealing with the tools or the resources the state had available to it and how they were utilized. So this to me is more about what tools we had available versus how we utilize the tools. So help me understand that.
I Representative Belcher, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, I would be absolutely happy to address that. And so as we've heard so frequently in testimony from organizations as diverse as today, from the Department of Homeland Security to Department of Health and Human Services, very much of the starting point for the recommendations made by our state agencies as a part of this COVID response originated with federal agencies and involved federal law and actions. And in this particular case, we know that the Department of Health and Human Services was reliant on recommendations coming from both the CDC as well as the FDA and others regarding its particular recommendations for COVID vaccination. If you were to now go to the website for the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services, you will find that they are recommending the COVID vaccine for certain age groups and in certain circumstances. And this was something that began in the immediate rollout of these of the vaccines and other products. And if you look currently at the recommendations for children on the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services website regarding the COVID-19 vaccines, they link directly to the CDC recommendations as their own recommendations. So in this case, there's really very little daylight between what was being recommended in the official actions of the state of New Hampshire and what was coming down as recommendations, and in some cases, perhaps more than recommendations from the federal government. And further, this request ties directly into testimony we received. In order to try to determine the veracity of the testimony, the genuineness of some of the documents we've been provided, and fill in some of the gaps that may be present in that information. Thank you.
Representative Merchant.
Thank you for that. It helps me to understand your point of view. I will say I totally disagree with it. I think it's outside of the scope of this committee. It is talking about the merits, the veracity of the resources, which are determined by the, quote, federal government. As I wanted to talk to Director Paxton, be clear. We're not here, I don't believe, to talk about the policy issues, but dealing with the response, which is dealing with things operationally. And to me, this is getting more into a policy discussion than it is to an operational discussion about how the state responded to it. So that's what I'm trying to understand, is that I see this is really going beyond the scope of our committee, and therefore I can't support it.
So in testimony, one of the things we're tasked with is the emergency use authorization. And one of the questions is when that authorization was given, and I guess maybe this would be a question for DHHS, is did they look at the data, or did they just accept that it was an emergency use authorization? When there was testing out there and data out there that was not known to the public, but yet these agencies knew about it, they were doing testing, and then they were changing their protocols, which would fly in the face of a science-based, when you're collecting science, you have a couple of protocols that you're following so that you can get your answers. And if you don't like your answers, you don't change midstream. And one of the things that we're talking about, and that Representative Belcher was talking about, was vSafe. And that was concerning. So I guess the question is when it comes to an emergency use authorization, and we're following as a state a directive from the federal government, are we discerning that? Or are they giving us are they giving our agencies the accurate information so that they can do what's best for our state? I think it's kind of intertwined, unfortunately. But it goes to the emergency use authorization portion of this, and with federal guidance. And we need to, as a committee, need to understand, did the federal government withhold information from our agencies? Because if they weren't giving all the facts, how could anybody in the state do what's best for its citizens if they're not giving all the facts? So Representative Lekis, Representative Ebel, and then Representative Merchant.
if you have bad policy, it doesn't matter how good your or great or fantastic your implementation is. If you have bad policy, bad things are going to happen. So I think it's very important for us to look at how we evaluated the policy. You know, did we just take somebody else's word for it and not look at it and just implement it? Or did we actually, and do we have in place a way of evaluating those policies coming from outside of our state to determine, you know, is that appropriate? Is that appropriate for us, et cetera? And I think unless we look at the policies and the way they were evaluated and et cetera, we could end up going down in the future a very bad road, perfectly implementing very bad policy. I'm not saying that's what we did, but I think that's why I think it's important to look at both policy and procedure.
Representative Eby.
Thank you. I do agree with Representative Merchant. I feel that this is outside the scope of our view. I understand that the actions that were being taken were basically undergirded by the federal advice that we were given. But that was basically the lay of the land during the pandemic, and that's what we were dealing with. As far as the letter itself is concerned, I really appreciate the thought and the effort that went into it. But the inquiry is basically a Freedom of Information Act inquiry. I think if it's going to go forward, it should be handled in that way. Number one, I can't imagine, and then looking at the end of it, we request access to all communications from any personnel within your agencies to all of these questions posed from all periods 2020 to the present. I mean, I just can't even imagine the mountain of information that we are requesting, how long it would take for this to be processed, and what we would even do with it if we got all the information that we're requesting. I mean, I certainly feel totally incapable of assessing the information that we would be getting, and I am not comfortable sending this out as a request from the committee. If there are committee members that want to pursue it on their own, I mean, that's obviously their right, but I'm not comfortable with this letter coming from the committee.
Thank you. And Representative Polozov.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with your point, and I agree with Representative Lekas. We need to be based on correct scientific decisions, and that's why we want to have data on both sides on vaccine efficacy. And if you say it's not relevant, but it's the same with masks. So if you read the handouts for mask sufficiency, none of these papers say New Hampshire. It doesn't say New Hampshire response, but it's relevant for us because we want to our decisions to based on correct policy regarding masks effectiveness or respirator effectiveness. So just the same way as this mask review is relevant to our mission, I see this letter is also relevant to our mission, just on different policy.
Representative Belcher, then Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just respond to some of the arguments that have been made, which I understand. I think the perspective of, but I would suggest that within our statement for the mission of this committee and the description and what we've undertaken, there is nothing that I can see that would remotely limit us from being able to look at policy and what policies were adopted and why policies were adopted. In fact, the charge of the legislature, according to the New Hampshire Constitution, is really twofold. The first one being the purse strings. We have the funding capacity of the state, and the second being the creation of public policy and, of course, oversight as well. So I don't see any reason to artificially limit the jurisdiction of the House as is constitutionally granted for policy oversight. In this particular manner. And I believe I would note, and I'll have to pull it up because I believe it's not specifically House rules, but it falls under the Mason's Manual of Legislative Rules, that it's within the discretion and jurisdiction, or discretion and authority of a committee chair to make a request on behalf of the committee. Just a request, not a subpoena or anything of that nature here, but just a request for information. Thank you.
Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll make 3 points. One, for us to go back and to evaluate whatever needed to be done with COVID implies, as a state, we have the resources to do it. So unless this legislative body wants to fund a major body with scientists and so forth to reevaluate what's going on with the federal government, I don't think we have the resources to do it. Number two, if we do, that's a complete redundancy, and it goes against taxpayer dollars and spending them wisely. Number two, there's going to be a mountain of data. And I don't know about you folks, I don't have the expertise to evaluate that data that's going to be in front of us. And I don't know where we're going to get the resources unless, again, we're going to fund those resources and somebody wants to pony up. If we have the purse strings, we have the authority, go back to the legislative body and ask for the hundreds of thousands of dollars that we need to make this thing work. And number four, as far as the constitutional, I don't disagree with Representative Belcher. We do have a constitutional authority and so forth. But what I'm going back to is the law that we passed. If we wanted to talk about policy when we passed the law, we should have included it in the policy at the time when we passed the RSA. We did not. We talked about the response to it, not the evaluation of the resources that were going to be utilized. So that was the time to talk about what we wanted to do as a committee and what we wanted to do as a legislative body with the oversight. That was the time to debate it on the floor and have that discussion. We did not. We talked about how we're going to respond to it. So that goes back to the policy. And for those reasons, I cannot support this letter. And I would move that this committee, before it even sends out this letter, it goes to the House Speaker for clarification with the House Speaker.
Representative Polizov. Representative Lekis.
I appreciate concern for taxpayers' funds, and I would agree if this letter was demanding to create a new system to track vaccine safety like VSafe, but this letter doesn't demand creating of VSafe. It just asks about data that, as we know, was produced through VSafe. So it's not about additional expenditures from taxpayer money, but it's exactly the opposite. It's about the utilization of the systems that was already funded by taxpayers, and taxpayers are entitled to those answers from the systems that they already funded.
Representative Lekis.
I'm going back to the policy part. Different states responded very differently with the same federal guidelines because different states checked it out differently. There were governors who actually read the studies, had meetings with, for instance, the doctors who said they use these different protocols to great effect, some of which we've heard from or about. And having done that, they went against what the federal government was saying and went based on what they themselves were learning from other than just the federal government, like from doctors who had great success and changed their protocols and changed their rules. And so I think it's important that we think about in any response in the future how we're going to do that instead of just taking one person one person's recommendations in the federal government, but to actually look at the big picture. How are we going to do that, and how are we going to evaluate? Because as we've seen now, some of that advice not only was wrong, we are hearing in the news lately where they're admitting that, yeah, they kind of knew it was wrong. And so, I don't know, I think we need to be thinking about how we are going to evaluate what advice we're getting to figure out what we're going to do in the future.
Representative Ebel.
Thank you. I still, even aside from all of that policy operational issue, I'm looking at this request. It's like, again, I respect what you did, but it's enormous. I mean, access to all communications from any personnel within your agencies for the last 4 years. I mean, that's enormous. And all the data on all these different programs, I don't even know I don't know how long it would take to comply with this request. I don't know how expensive it would be for the feds to put together the response to this request. I'm not sure how we would ever have the capability to review all of the information. And we have very limited, I mean, I certainly have limited medical capacity to review it. Even if you just set aside whether you think it's right or wrong to send this letter, this request is just unbelievably broad, and I can't support it. So it's almost noon. I think what we have to do is decide. I mean, if you want to take a vote or whatever, or if you want to take a shot at refining the letter, but I can't support it as it is.
Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If we want to, as a committee, and I'm following up on Representative Likas, I don't disagree as far as the issue of the policy, but I think if you want to include in the review in saying, how do we, as a state, review the information, that's internal to us. Not so much the validity of the data coming to us, but how do we internally look at data that we receive and evaluate its merits. That's different than going back to the federal government asking for the source of data and doing our own analysis. But looking at the process is saying, what's the process we have in the state to evaluate this information to ensure that we're doing the right thing? And I think that has merits to it. And number two, when you start looking at the end result, and I keep going back to this with our committee, I use the number of deaths per 100,000. And I am proud to say that as a state, we were the second lowest in the country. The only one lower than us was Hawaii because they could lock down the island. So when you start looking at the use of the policy information, there are other states, I don't disagree, that didn't follow the same logic that we had here. But you can see with the variance and what it created. So if you're looking at the end result being deaths and people survived, which to me is critical, then I think we did a fairly good job in using the information we had. But if you want to go back and say, what's the process we do internally? Because in a lot of ways, that's to me is more key than trying to get down all this information.
Representative Likas.
I think part of our assignment is looking at not just deaths, but other, like we've seen in the education field, huge harms that were done based on policies that were followed that we're now finding the people who suggested those policies actually knew they were not effective and would not work. And we are seeing those harms. And part of it is not just deaths, but what are the other harms? Were there harms to businesses? Were there harms? How many people died not from COVID, but from despair? You know, the suicide rate went way up. What could we have done differently to keep that from happening? Kids like 2 years behind developmentally, et cetera. Could we have done things differently? What did we need to look at? And I think those are, I'm talking more of the general because comments are made of the general, what we as a committee should be doing, not so much the specific letter. I was talking about our general, not so much the specific letter. This letter, I think, has some, for us to be able to make decisions based on what other organizations did, I think it's important for us to understand how those organizations work, because, you know, that'll affect, okay, should we trust everything coming out of here? Or should we be asking questions, et cetera, from different organizations? But I do agree that when it comes to this, that last sentence, further, we would request access to all community, that is just, I agree, that's way overboard. Way overboard. But the original stuff, we're really just asking, we had testimony supposedly about this organization. So do we believe with that testimony? Do we search it a little farther and find out, can we get verification from that organization? I think that's a reasonable thing for us to do.
Representative Bebo.
Oh gosh, now I just looked at Representative Merchant and completely lost my train of thought. But I thought you actually, no, I know what it was. You had I really appreciate the discussion. I think though you had a good point, Representative Merchant, when you said maybe another way of looking at this is not so much as trying to take a really deep dive that is going to be very difficult for us to do on what the federal decisions were, but maybe talk a little bit more with the public health people and understand that when these policies come down, do you exercise independent judgment? How are those policies that you're getting and the instructions that you're getting, how are they assessed? And I mean, and I wouldn't be surprised if they said this was a pandemic. We were in like, you know, pandemic mode and we didn't have a lot of time to sit back and assess everything. But then we could say, okay, well, in a similar situation like this, what sort of policies could we put in place that would give some structure to the kind of analysis that you might want to do? I mean, that sort of thing. But this is an enormous task to dive into it at this level. And maybe we might even just want to wait until we see the after action report from Homeland Security and then take action following that.
Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to speak to a couple of the issues that have been brought up, including the bipartisan concern here that accessing the communications records for anything responsive to the other questions asked here. And I just want to point out that it's only been about 2 weeks since nationally the Federal Department of Health and Human Services took the rather extreme step of sanctioning to the point of permanent disqualification the organization's EcoHealth Alliance and its proprietor, Peter Daszak, who were involved in coronavirus gain-of-function research. They took these extreme steps against this organization, which directly relates to pandemic response and the whole issue we're looking at. They took this extreme step, not based on the information that they were provided, based on questions asked to this organization, but because they got a hold of this organization's internal communications and found discrepancies between what they were being told and what was happening internally in the organizations, where they discovered malfeasance and the purposeful withholding of information that may have been critical at an early point in this pandemic. And that's the reason I included that particular thing. I'm not looking for every bit of communications from the entire agencies during that period, only those that are responsive to the handful of questions that are posed within this document. It may be a substantial tranche of data. I would be happy to parse it. I think if we lack the internal resources, I think that a sort of, what's it called? A socially networked review of it could bring anything important to light for us. And frankly, I think without without access to internal communications, I see almost no point in even asking these questions, because we have to be able to verify the veracity of them by seeing what they were talking about internally as, a contemporary to the decisions being made. And I would say, given that there is obviously some debate over where the authority lies for sending a letter like this, I would recommend, do we perhaps consult with the parliamentarian to see just what his input is on it?
I would, if I can, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I would strongly recommend that, because if we're going to send something to a federal government and we don't per se even have the authority to send a letter, it's not only going to fall flat when they receive it, it's going to make us look in a bad light. And if we don't have the jurisdiction within our legislative body, and I'd like to have someone put that forth and saying, yes, we do or we do not, because if we don't, we shouldn't be sending the letter at all. That's the first question. The other one's going to be, when all this information comes back, if it ever comes back, are we going to get it back in time to evaluate it before our report due by November 1st? And on top of that, I want to say, Mr. Belcher, I want to thank you for willing to dive into a mountain of paperwork to do it. But I can tell you from my point of view, I don't have the expertise. I'd like to send it to my social network, but a lot of the people in my social network don't have the expertise to really look at the documents themselves and make that evaluation. So without having someone who truly has the credentials to look at that information coming back to us, I'm not sure what we can do with it.
So I agree, and I would never send out a letter like this without checking with the Speaker's office, first off, just so everyone understands. The other thing is the biggest question I have, and I would really, really like an answer to, is the vSafe data. I think after what we heard, that hearing, I have so many questions, and I want to know when they decided, and we heard in testimony, and it was shown to us, and I actually have some of the slides that I have to send off to the committee from that presentation, so I'll get those slides out to everyone. But why in the middle of doing a scientific protocol, they change midstream to mimic another agency when they're two separate agencies? To me, that is the biggest question, when the data was reflecting something that probably wasn't what they wanted based on what we saw. But I want to know myself if it's, I'm told that it's factual, but I want to verify it. I always like to verify what I have.
Madam Chair, I think if we can narrow this down to that one issue, okay, then the scope of the information coming back is going to be minimal compared to the other mountain of data. And at that point in time, based upon that, we can probably find some resource internally within the state to evaluate it. But if this letter as written is so broad, the scope is way beyond this committee. But if you want to narrow it down to strictly that one issue and that one issue only, and you also go to the Speaker's office, the parliamentarian, to be sure that we, as a committee, and particularly yourself as the chair who signs off on it, that you have the authority to do that.
I would absolutely never send anything out without the authority of the Speaker's office or the parliamentarian, ever. But I think that narrowing the scope of this may ensure, not guarantee, that we may get data back over the summer in time for the report. And I had, like I said, I had so many more questions about the testing of this and the decisions made by the different departments. And this was of particular concern to me because it would affect, basically, it could affect how every state handled things, technically. And Representative Chrétien has a question.
I guess. Just with respect to requesting vSafe and VAERS data, that's actually all like publicly available. You can just go online and get it. So I don't think we need to necessarily request those data. Certainly just want to mention that in interpreting those data, it's really key to keep in mind that these are all just reports that people make voluntarily.
Right, so they're
There's
not
nothing
signed.
to verify that they're accurate. Certainly not saying that this was a common thing, but I certainly saw, on social media, people saying they shouldn't be pushing vaccines. We got to flood these reports with, information about data. So I think that those might not be the most useful data for us to look at when considering side effects and efficacy, as opposed to, information from hospitals, that sort of thing. And then finally, just to this idea of the control group receiving a vaccine at some point after the vaccine was approved. My understanding is that's like a pretty common thing, because when you're doing a clinical trial, if you see that there's evidence of efficacy, it becomes an ethical issue to withhold the effective treatment from the control group. So I don't think that's something that we should. I think harping on that would reveal a lack of understanding on our part, and I would not sign on to that. Thanks.
So I understand about the VAERS data, where that's voluntary a lot, but the vSafe data was only given to people that received the actual vaccine. It was a very controlled group of, I think it was it 10,000? I believe, 40,000, whatever. And the data was populated, but it was only for those that were vaccinated. So it's very specific. And so that data was specific. And the other thing was how the FDA and the CDC, they had protocols on what scientific method each group was going to do. And one of them midstream, and I'm not sure which agency it was, switched over to the other one and disregarded everything else that they had gotten. That is of concern, because yes.
Madam Chair, I think we could go in this is saying, when that happened between the agencies and there was a change, I'd ask the question to the people at the state level, how did that impact your assessment? Because I think it's going to be how we responded to the information that was provided to us versus the source of the information. And I think that's more critical than looking at going through mountains of data, is asking our state resources, how do we utilize information? What's the process? How do we evaluate it? And when something gets switched from one agent to another, what did you do? To me, that makes more sense than trying to go out. It's a rabbit hole. And I'd rather look at it and saying, I got the rabbit, I don't need to find the hole, is talk to the person at the point in time at the Department of Health and Human Services, maybe it's Ben Chen, Dr. Chen, is what did you do and why'd you do it? That to me has more merits to it than this whole letter.
Well, this is only based on one person's testimony as well. That's all we have.
Representative Lekas.
I think to even be able to do that, we have to understand what information they had. So we've found out now, due to all of the requests that he's made and everything, that these things happen. But did we even know that? Did they even let us know that they changed their policies? Seems like that would be something that's important for us to know, because if we're not getting information from these agencies, we need to know that. I can't hear you.
I guess my concern is going to be, as legislators, it's not for us to have that information. It's more for the people we rely upon, that we put in positions that have that authority, is how they use that information. And again, it's back to how the state responded by using the information, because I want to know how the state responded and how they evaluated the information they were utilizing. To me, that's more critical than this whole issue of the FDA and CDC and so forth. That's what I'm trying to get to.
Well, what I'm saying is, if they're not getting the information they should be getting, they may be responding perfectly to the information they got. But we have a lot of information that has come out later that said these things were happening that nobody knew about at the time. And so were our agencies basing their response on incomplete information? And how do we in the future try to make sure they are getting complete information?
I think it refers to something called Monday morning quarterback.
Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make a little bit of a correction because I think there was a bit of a misstatement regarding one of the questions that is in here. Just to be clear, this letter does not ask, did these vaccine manufacturers immunize the control group as a part during the study? That's not what this asks, because that would be a useless question because it lacks context. Rather, here's what the question actually asks. Can you verify the vaccination of the control group occurring despite objections from either of your agencies? Now, that's important because we received specific testimony that the vaccination occurred over the objections of federal regulators. And that would be an interesting point to know that might help us understand the overall picture here a little bit. So it's a totally different issue than did they vaccinate the control group, because of course they're always going to eventually vaccinate the control group if it's approved. The key there is, did any of the agencies ask them not to vaccinate the control group, and did they move forward with that over the objections of federal regulators?
Representative Polozov.
I want to return to previous topic, so I don't know if we are done with this one. If I may.
Just 1 second. Right now, we're at an impasse regarding the letter. I think that the first thing I'm going to do is go to the Speaker's office and see if this is something that we can send out as a committee. And once I get that, then I guess the next question is do we refine the letter? How do we move forward? Whether if he says yes or he says no. I mean, no is going to be pretty straightforward. And that will end the discussion. So we'll just, but if he says yes, then the next question is
The drafting of
the drafting of the letter. So,
we won't be here.
so I'm not exactly sure how to move forward with that portion of it. And I've got multiple hands. Representative Ebel, Representative Belcher, Representative Merchant.
Okay, so all I can say is I've got to leave at 12:30, but, so one thing we could do in the meantime is we could actually inquire of DHHS or whomever and just say, in the face of the testimony that we received that asserted this, we'd be interested in you developing, an answer for us, whether you observe this phenomenon, whether this is just based on the testimony that we happen to get. I mean, you could ask them about this and how they responded, and that would get at this whole issue of the response. But the other thing we can do is we can just wait and see what this after action report says and what is in there. But I think it's going to be hard for us to reach consensus on the letter over the summer. And the last thing I want to say is there's nothing that stands in the way of an individual representative requesting information themselves through the FOIA process, which both these agencies have.
Thank you. I do think that we need to definitely reach out to DHHS. I was hoping that once we get through this section, there's some folks that I'd like to have in the fall. I'd like to have DHHS in again, Dr. Chan, some people from special ed. even the Department of Labor, because I think dealing that department has a lot to do with the federal emergency dollars and how the ripple effects are still affecting us today with decisions that have come down through that. So leaving it at that, Representative Belcher, then Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And here's kind of how I'm envisioning this, and you can tell me if you think I'm correct. I fully am supportive of going, of course, consulting the parliamentarian, seeing what the procedure in place is for an item like this. I see a sort of decision tree coming. Either it's going to be we don't have the authority, which I don't think is going to be the answer, but okay, we're done. Number two, we have the authority, but it falls to a vote of the House. Well, that would mean it's out for this year. We have the authority, but it falls to a vote of the committee, which would have to wait till the next time we reconvene, which will be in the fall, which is probably too late to submit this. The last and final, which I see is probably the only way to proceed on this, and is what I am pretty sure actually is the correct parliamentary rule, is that the authority for this lies with the chair. In which case, it would be on the discretion of Madam Chair. If I may respond, Madam Chair, at this time, I don't think that would be feasible, simply because we're not meeting again until fall.
Can I make a recommendation? Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know exactly legislative what you can do. I know when I was on the board, a board of pharmacy at the time, when we had something like this, what the chair could do was to draft something, send it to each one of us. We could not reply to all because it's 91A violation, but we could respond individually to the chair saying we approve or disapprove. So it's like taking a vote without going through the process, but it has to be done in a way, and this is good to talk to the parliamentarian, because legislatively, I don't know what the rules are, but on the board, we would send out the draft. Each board member could respond yay or nay, and at that point in time, they can move forward.
If I may, Madam Chair, just to respond
Yes.
to that, I can just about guarantee that would violate parliamentary procedure because it would effectively represent a remote vote. If it does in fact require a vote, I don't think there's going to be any way to move forward with this. I think the only path forward is if we do find it is at the discretion of the chair, in which case it's just that simple. And I would be happy to work with Madam Chair to accept any revisions or plug anything else in that would be appropriate.
Representative Lucas.
If instead of taking a vote, yea or nay, what we do is communally make suggestions for making it better,
You could do that.
and then Madam Chair would decide whether or not to send it or not. That way it's up to her, which she would have the authority for,
That's
but
fair.
she would have the input
right.
from all of us.
The other was, in the meantime, if I could ask the chair, go back to Representative Abel's question, I would recommend the chair send a letter to the Department of Health and Human Services and saying, what is the process when you receive information and you have possibly conflicting information? What's the process? How do you decide how to move forward with the policy based upon the information that's provided to you? A, how do you assess it? B, how do you utilize it? To me, that's more appropriate with our own state agency coming from the chair, asking that fundamental question to the department.
Thank you for that, Representative Merchant. I think it's important. And the question is I wouldn't assume that they receive conflicting information. They may not have. And maybe the question is how did you assess the information instead of reading something into that, Representative?
I mean, basically, you can pose the question to them that we got testimony from this person. I mean, we'll have the slides or whatever, and he asserted X, Y, and Z. To your knowledge, was that the situation? And if it was the situation, how did you respond? You know, something like that. I mean, I think this whole thing, we're assessing, obviously, but I also think it's just really difficult because people were scrambling, you know, trying to do their best.
Representative Lucas.
I know we keep saying people were scrambling, but this was a 2-year response. In the beginning, I'm willing to excuse any mistakes that were made in the beginning, because clearly there was a lot we didn't know and everybody was doing their best. And I believe everybody was doing their best. But there were a lot of decisions that got made along the road where we weren't scrambling, where there was time. And so those are we need to look at that. But the other thing is to ask them is, were they aware? I mean, did they know this information? Because that's part of what we want to see is, where are we getting complete information? Where is the breakdown in communication? Now we see this, and it's one thing to say, how did you respond to this? But they might not have even gotten this information. And so that would be a question to ask them is, we received testimony that this is what happened. Were you aware of this at all? You know, was this something that even came across your plate for you to even consider?
Representative.
The letter sort of lays out some of the questions, right? But I mean, unfortunately, we're in a situation now where we're not meeting over the summer, and that's just, you know, I'm not sure what we can do about that, but we can ask the question in the meantime if we want to.
Right, and I will speak with the speaker probably today if he's in, and if not, it'll be next week. But anyways, to get an answer on this. But I think it's important, and to Representative Lecka's point, yes, at first everyone was scrambling, nobody knew what was going on. But 6 months in, there was a lot of conflicting information coming out. And then, as we heard in testimony from the Honorable Representative Gay, she had some really good points to make about because, you know, people with different mindsets coming together to hash it out, because to me, that's what makes the best policies. Okay, because you're taking in all points of views. I think it's important that we understand that we all are coming from a different perspective on this. We all experienced something different during the pandemic, and it's individual for everybody. So I think in light of that, I think sending something off to DHHS is important, but I will also consult the speaker regarding the letter. And I will let the committee know what the speaker says. Representative Polizov does have something to say.
Madam Chair, I need to leave as well. I just want to say thank you for chairing this, and hopefully everyone has a great summer. And it's restful and relaxing after the community conferences we had. So, but thank you for what you're doing.
Yes,
Thank you.
very much. It's a good conversation.
Thank you all. I know that some of you are leaving. But Representative Polizov you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative Merchant, for shared data on review of mask effectiveness. I need to make sure for the record that that review also showed that deaf people have challenges when masks are used, and that people with certain medical conditions, you can see it in a summary, they require some exceptions. And during the pandemic, we knew that it was very difficult and often impossible to get necessary medical exception. That review also raised the question of mask harm to children, and it's not in the summary what was the finding. Second point out of 3 points I need to make about it is this review raised some controversy around fully fitted respirators versus closed masks, and you can see it on page 5 of the handout that there was a revision that need to be made because there was misunderstanding of what this review did, and they even used a picture of a mask that according to that review was not effective, so they had to change the picture used for that review because a misunderstanding of what that review actually says. And a certain point to what Representative Merchant stressed, that masks are creating social cultural change, even regardless effective they are or not. And I agree with this point. I just don't agree with seeing it as necessarily positive things. So when Representative Merchant says that when everyone forced to wear masks, it means that virus is serious. Yes, it's true, but it's creating pressure, it's creating stress, it's creating fear. When there's a pressure, we see the situation when medical exemptions that need to be granted are not granted. We see that patients have worse outcome, and it's pretty established scientific knowledge that stress actually worsens outcome during the illness. So if it's not necessary, it can have worse population outcome. And finally, it's we have separation of state and religion for reason. We shouldn't be just based on beliefs. We believe that it's a deadly disease and we are all going to die. Like if facts are contradicting it, we shouldn't be forcing people to wear masks just because it's our belief that doesn't matches the fact and actual death rate, for example, among children. So those are my point, regardless papers that were distributed. Thank you.
I thank you for sharing that, Representative Polozov. Does anybody else from the committee have anything that they wish to say? Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would like to thank Representative Polozov, and I would essentially second those remarks in that I think when the state decides to make certainly mandates, perhaps even recommendations, but certainly mandates that are of a symbolic nature in order to steer people in any sort of particular direction. I believe that is fundamentally a violation of the freedom of conscience, and it really gets mighty close, if not over the line, of violating the Establishment of Religion clause of the First Amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Belcher. Does anyone else have anything else they would like to add? Seeing none, I hope everyone has a wonderful summer. And I will see you all in the fall. So I will call this meeting adjourned at 12:36. Thank you.